Welcome to the seventh and last Sunday of Easter season at Trinity Place. Greetings. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a reflection for the seventh and last Sunday of Easter season. And it's a reflection on the book of Acts, chapter 1, 6 through 14. Book of Acts, chapter 1, 6 through 14. And John's Gospel, chapter 17, 1 through 11. Now, the 3-year ministry of Jesus is Act 1 in a 3-act play. Then the betrayal and the arrest, the trial and execution are Act 2. Then the resurrection, of course, is Act 3. Now, the author of the book of Acts, who is also the author of Luke's Gospel, has a dilemma. The book of Acts is the story of the earliest followers of Jesus. And it has to figure out an exit for Jesus before the next play, a kind of sequel, can be written. So the book of Acts sometimes gets referred to as a history of the earliest church, but it's a story, not a history. A story, as a story, it communicates way better than if we treat it as some kind of history, which it's not. Anyway, the author of Luke Acts creates an epilogue and has Jesus exit the way the great prophets of Israel always exited, into the clouds. Elijah did it that way, and so did Moses. It's a very natural, supernatural way for a holy man or woman to exit. Buddhism is full of ascending mystics. And in Islam, Jesus disappears like that as well. In fact, in the Quran tells the story of Jesus did not really die on the cross. It says that he may have passed death altogether when he was lifted up and taken directly up to God. Because it's inconceivable in Islam that a prophet chosen by God for such an elevated purpose could ever be allowed to be betrayed and executed at the hands of enemies. So Jesus was taken up. Now, figuring out a fitting exit for such godly human beings is a difficult challenge because, well, let's face it, because death is messy. A torturous death is the messiest, not to mention the most shocking and scandalous for an agent of God. What was God thinking? Anyway, how does the storyteller write an exit worthy of the resurrected Christ? Now, for any of us who have ever held vigil with someone who is dying, what I'm about to say is utterly recognizable. There comes a time, a specific moment perhaps, when a person is ready to die, and they do. They let go. They may not let go they may not die at the moment they let go, but it begins the process of the body shutting down. It is a moment when the person seems to say, even if they can't use words, okay, I'm done. let me go. So be it. Now, some people view this moment as a resignation of the mind to the inevitable conclusion of the body. I think of it as a body, mind, and spirit giving way in unison to a trust in a power greater than itself. But whatever the substance or the meaning of that moment, there is clearly a boundary between life and death that all of us cross: the good, the bad, the ugly, and the Christ. If we do not die suddenly, then we will all likely come to that moment ourselves. Now, the New Testament has numerous depictions of that moment for Jesus. The one in today's readings from John and the book of Acts are just two of many choices. There are pre-crucifixion moments like the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is purported to say, "Thy will be done, not mine, but thine." And then the deathly moments on the cross when the narrator describes Jesus as giving up his spirit. And then there are, like today, post-crucifixion scenes when the lingering presence of Jesus must finally make an exit. Jesus has to go for the community to be born. But to me, they all have the same quality. It's the moment of letting go of the body, of life as we've known it, and free falling into the unknown. It's a moment of choice, even if it's inevitable. Please hover over that for a moment. It's a moment of choice, even though it will be made for us if we don't make it for ourselves. Now, obviously, I don't know what the difference is because I've never gone through it. But I know from watching others that we can open our arms to it, but that it is inevitable even if we do not. This side of the choice, the space that we live in now, is poignantly infused with grief and desire, magnified by the slipping away of what we have known and loved, all mixed like myrrh with what we wish we had loved more and better. We do not know what is on the other side of that choice, but it looks like peace or resignation or relief, depending on how we view it. You and I right now live on this side of that choice. And as far as I'm concerned, and this is just one man's opinion, way too much of Christianity is invested with the other side of that choice. I think it's an enormously profound act of faith to be engaged in a spiritual practice that pays very little attention to the other side until we get there. Personally, it seems to me that the primary act of faith is to trust God with the unknown and focus on this side without anxiety about the other side. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best. The question is not what we're willing to die for, it's what we're willing to live for. So I'll ask you and myself along with you, what are you living for? What are you living for? I'm going to tread on thin ice here because it might be messing with your idea about Jesus. So take this with a grain of salt. I do not think Jesus meant to die, not when he did. I know the story gets narrated that way, but I do not think Jesus meant to die any more than Martin Luther King Jr. meant to die, any more than Dietrich Bonhoeffer meant to die, any more than Oscar Romero meant to die, or any martyr in his or her right mind means to die at the hands of others. Now, that's not to say they didn't know they were in danger, but they did not court death for the sake of a cause. They did not want to die for their cause. Rather, they lived for the sake of their cause, regardless of the outcome. They knew what they were living for. And if it cost them their life, well, then they were not going to measure the cost. What gets lost in the death of martyrs is what they're living for and the power of that decision. Jesus knew what he was living for. And the Gospels tell us about it over and over and over and over again. Jesus knew what he was living for. His messy, torturous death turned Jesus' life into a wick illuminating the darkness long after his last breath. Any star that burned out millions of years ago continues to flicker across the darkness of space. And because of what he lived for and how he lived, Jesus is a candle that still burns. So I think we are misguided to focus so much on how Jesus died rather than how he lived and his choice to surrender. Now, there is a hard but spectacular wisdom at the core of our spiritual tradition that is so obvious that I think we live in its light but often forget about its presence. Anyone who has ever loved deeply, who has ever loved out beyond the boundary of self, knows the heartbeat of this wisdom at the core of our spiritual tradition. It is this: the wick of holiness that siphons God into our hearts like an artesian well moves the lifeblood of the earth to its surface is one person's willingness to disappear so that someone else may live. But that choice is made in advance. You know, the choice of what we live for makes our disappearance a possible outcome under unexpected circumstances. A firefighter, for example, who enters a burning building to save a life, even the life of a stranger, knows what he or she is living for. A human rights worker who lives precariously on the margins of violence and is murdered while non-violently advocating or assisting those more vulnerable knows what she or he is living for. The healthcare professional who enters a quarantine zone in order to care for dying victims or to find out what's killing them knows what he or she is living for. A combatant who willingly enters into armed struggle in service of her or his homeland knows what they're living for. We can understand parents endangering themselves for their children. We get that. But harder to understand is the risk of one's life in order that a stranger may live. It is an act rooted in an idea or a belief or a hope that is greater than one's own life, and it illuminates the darkness when it takes place. It defies the logic of self-preservation to willingly, to perhaps even unnecessarily risk one's life on behalf of others or in the service of an idea is stunning. At the heart of our tradition, when we peel away the images of torture, suffering, and violence from the cross, we see clearly what Jesus is living for. And then we hear him ask, what are you living for? The spiritual physics of Christianity lies within this matrix of a choice to live for something rather than in fear of losing things. It's not a demand, but an invitation, a choice. It's an invitation to live life on behalf of others and for the furtherance of an idea or two or three about the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Living our lives out beyond the boundaries of self is a decision and it's a choice. It may not get us killed, but knowing what we're living for will in fact define who we are and light a match that engulfs the darkness. Unlike the storytellers of Jesus, most of us will not get to choose our exit story, but we do get to choose what we're living for. We also, when the time comes, we get to surrender or trust in a power greater than ourselves. Peace be with you.